You get your paycheck on Friday. Before you ever see it, roughly 30% has already left for federal and state income tax, Social Security, and Medicare. You accept that. That's the system. Everybody pays. Then you spend what's left on rent, groceries, a car payment, maybe a streaming service or two. Normal life. Nothing unusual happening here, except something unusual is happening. The way that tax system is structured. The way that rent payment moves through a landlord's balance sheet. The way that car payment flows through a financing company. And the way your grocery spending gets processed through a payment network are all doing something specific with a portion of your money before it settles. And where it settles consistently is slightly higher up the income ladder than where it started. This isn't a conspiracy. It doesn't require anyone coordinating behind closed doors. It's structural. It's baked into the design of 4 specific systems that middle-class Americans interact with every single week. And the total annual transfer, when you attach real numbers to it, is not a rounding error. This video is about how the middle class subsidizes the rich without knowing it, not through fraud, not through theft, through the normal, legal, unremarkable operation of systems that were designed over decades to work exactly this way. And I'll warn you now, the capital gains tax section is going to make some of you genuinely angry, because it's the most explicit example in the entire American tax code of 2 people doing economically equivalent work, and being taxed at dramatically different rates based purely on which category their income falls into. My name is Gaurav, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time mapping the places where money moves upward without being labeled as such. If you've ever felt like you're paying more than your fair share without being able to put your finger on exactly why, subscribe and hit that like button, because today we're tracing the specific routes that transfer takes. Quick thing first, not a financial advisor, not financial advice, just the structural map they never handed you with your first pay stub. Let me introduce you to 2 people, Ryan and Catherine. Ryan is a project manager earning $85,000 a year in W-2 income. Catherine is an investor with a $2 million portfolio, earning roughly $120,000 a year in long-term capital gains and qualified dividends. Ryan feels like he earns decent money and pays a lot of taxes. Catherine feels like she manages her portfolio carefully and pays what she owes. The amount each of them actually pays in federal income tax on their respective incomes is not what most people would guess when they hear those 2 descriptions side by side. Hold on to them. We'll come back. Here's the framing that makes this entire system click. The middle-class subsidy isn't a single mechanism. It's 4 separate structural features of modern American economic life that each, independently, transfer a portion of middle-class wealth upward. None of them requires any individual to behave badly. None of them is illegal. All of them are working simultaneously every week on the paycheck you just received. Let's go through them. Layer 1. The capital gains tax differential. And this is the most structurally explicit of the 4. When Ryan earns $85,000 managing projects, every dollar of that income is taxed as ordinary income. Depending on his state and deductions, his effective federal tax rate lands somewhere around 18% to 22% on the full amount. He cannot choose a different tax category for his labor income. It's ordinary income, taxed at ordinary income rates, period. When Catherine earns $120,000 from long-term capital gains on assets she's held for more than a year, that income is taxed at the preferential long-term capital gains rate. For her income level, that rate is 15%, not 22%. Not 18%. 15% flat on income that is in many cases simply the result of holding assets while they appreciated without performing any additional labor. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Ryan, earning $85,000 in labor income, pays roughly $15,000 to $18,000 in federal income tax. Catherine, earning $120,000 in capital gains, pays $18,000. She earns 41% more than Ryan. She pays approximately the same absolute dollar amount in federal tax. Her effective rate on income is roughly 15%. His is roughly 20%. The tax code has 2 different rates for 2 different kinds of income, and the kind of income wealthy people primarily earn is taxed at the lower rate by design, enshrined in law. A 2021 analysis by the Tax Policy Center found that the preferential rate on long-term capital gains and qualified dividends costs the U.S. Treasury approximately $167 billion annually in foregone tax revenue. That $167 billion represents the gap between what higher-income investment earners actually pay and what they would pay if their investment income were taxed at the same ordinary income rates that apply to Ryan's paycheck. It's a subsidy paid for by the tax system that taxes labor income more heavily than investment income, and the people primarily funding that gap through their proportionally higher effective rates are the people whose income comes primarily from work rather than assets. Layer 2, the landlord equity mechanism, and this is the one that affects renters most directly. When you pay rent, your payment does two things simultaneously. It covers your landlord's mortgage payment, which builds equity in an asset the landlord owns, and it may generate cash flow above that mortgage, which becomes the landlord's income. You receive no equity from that transaction. You receive a month of housing. This isn't inherently unfair. Renting is a legitimate transaction. But here's the structural layer most renters have never calculated. The average American renter pays rent for roughly 6 to 8 years before buying a home, if they buy at all. During those years, assuming average rent of approximately $1,700 a month in a mid-cost city, they transfer roughly $122,000 to $163,000 to landlords, a significant portion of which goes toward building equity in assets those landlords own. That equity, once realized through sale, is taxed at the preferential capital gains rate we just discussed. A Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies analysis found that rental housing has been one of the primary wealth accumulation vehicles for households in the top income quintile over the past 2 decades, specifically because rising rents have allowed landlords to build equity and generate income from assets whose appreciation gets taxed at preferential rates, while renters themselves accumulate no equity from the same housing costs they're covering. The renter pays, the landlord builds wealth. The tax code rewards the landlord's wealth accumulation at a lower rate than it taxes the renter's income used to fund that accumulation. Layer 3. The regressive nature of payroll taxes, and this is the layer that hits middle-class earners hardest relative to their income. Social Security tax applies to earned income up to $160,200 in 2023. Above that cap, additional earnings are exempt from the Social Security portion of payroll tax entirely. This means Ryan, earning $85,000, pays Social Security tax on 100% of his income. A corporate executive earning $500,000 pays Social Security tax on $160,200, or roughly 32% of their income. The higher the income above the cap, the smaller the effective payroll tax rate. Combined with the Medicare surcharge that applies to higher earners, the total picture is a payroll tax system where middle-income workers pay at or near their maximum possible effective rate, while very high earners pay a smaller and smaller percentage of their total income as their earnings rise above the cap. The system designed to fund social insurance for all Americans extracts a disproportionate percentage from the middle, specifically because the cap means the contribution rate falls as incomes rise beyond it. The Social Security Administration's own data shows that the effective payroll tax rate for workers earning between $50,000 and $100,000 runs between 7% and 8% of total compensation, including employer share. For workers earning above $500,000, the effective rate drops to between 2% and 3% of total compensation. Same program. Dramatically different effective rates based purely on where earnings fall relative to the statutory cap. Layer 4. The consumer credit premium, and this is the layer that intersects with everything we covered in the invisible tax video. Higher income individuals with strong credit profiles, significant assets, and established credit histories borrow at dramatically lower interest rates than middle-income borrowers. This isn't just a difference in degree. It's a structural feature of how credit is priced in the United States. A household with a 780 credit score, significant assets, and stable W-2 income borrows at prime- or prime plus a small spread. A household with a 640 credit score, limited assets, and variable income borrows at prime plus several percentage points, or doesn't access prime credit at all and pays credit card rates of 20% or more. A 2022 study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the aggregate interest cost differential between higher and lower income borrowers, after controlling for actual default risk, runs to tens of billions of dollars annually. Part of this differential is legitimate risk pricing, but a significant portion represents what the researchers called a credit premium, an additional cost extracted from middle and lower income borrowers that isn't fully explained by their actual risk profile. And that flows as income to the lenders and investors who hold that debt. The consumer credit system charges more to borrow from people who can least afford the higher rate, and the spread above actual risk-adjusted cost flows upward as investment returns to the holders of that debt, who are disproportionately concentrated in higher income brackets. Now here's the research that reframes all of this in the most useful way. A comprehensive analysis by the Rand Corporation, examining income and wealth trends from 1975 to 2018, found that if income distribution had remained at its 1975 ratios, rather than shifting through the structural mechanisms we've been discussing, the bottom 90% of American earners would collectively receive approximately $2.5 trillion more annually than they currently do. Not from redistribution, from the baseline distribution that would occur if the structural transfer mechanisms had not been embedded in the tax code, the credit system, and the real estate market over those decades. The transfer isn't theoretical. It's ongoing, it's measurable, and it has been accumulating for 50 years. So here's the practical framework. 3 moves that partially put you on the right side of these transfer mechanisms rather than purely funding them. Move 1 addresses the capital gains differential. The most direct way to access preferential tax rates on your own investment income is to hold index fund investments in taxable accounts for more than 1 year before selling, deliberately structuring the sale timing to qualify for long-term capital gains treatment. This is the same mechanism Catherine uses, accessible to anyone with taxable investment accounts, not just high-net-worth investors. Every dollar of long-term capital gain you realize in a low-income year, including potentially an early retirement, is taxed at rates dramatically lower than your equivalent labor income would have been. Move 2 addresses the landlord equity mechanism. If you're currently renting and plan to remain in a geographic area for at least 5 years, the equity accumulation you're currently funding for your landlord is potentially redirectable toward your own balance sheet through homeownership, particularly in markets where the math of ownership versus renting still favors buying. This is not universally true and depends heavily on local market conditions, but the directional principle is correct. Owning even a modest property converts your housing cost from a pure transfer to a partial wealth-building mechanism. Move 3 addresses the consumer credit premium, the single highest leverage financial move available to anyone in the middle income range, is aggressively building credit score and reducing debt-to-income ratio to access the lowest tier of borrowing rates, specifically because the spread between what a 640-score borrower pays and what a 780-score borrower pays on the same loan amount often represents tens of thousands of dollars over the life of a mortgage or auto loan, a transfer that can be interrupted entirely by qualifying for the better rate. Ryan, by the way, shifted a portion of his taxable savings into a standard index fund and held for 5 years before taking any gains, qualifying those gains for the 15% long-term rate rather than the 22% ordinary income rate he pays on his salary. The effective tax saving on $30,000 in realized gains was $2,100, not transformative in a single year, but applied over a full investment lifetime. The cumulative difference between ordinary income rates and long-term capital gains rates on the same invested dollars is one of the most durable wealth-building advantages in the entire tax code, and it's available to anyone patient enough to hold. Here's the truth I'd want a friend to tell me directly. You are not paranoid for feeling like the system takes more from you than it appears to. You are accurate. The 4 mechanisms we walked through today are structural, legal, and measurable, and they each channel a portion of middle-class economic activity upward through tax treatment, equity mechanics, payroll caps, and credit pricing. None of them requires a villain. All of them require knowing they exist to begin navigating around them rather than simply funding them every week without realizing it. You can't opt out of the system, but you can stop being the person who only ever sits on the wrong side of each of its 4 structural features. If this changed how you think about where your money actually goes after it leaves your paycheck, drop a comment telling me which of the 4 mechanisms you felt most in your own financial life. I actually read them. And if you want the full picture on how the invisible tax hits your paycheck before the spending even starts, that video is on the screen right now. Go watch that one next. I'll see you in it.